Hey folks, Steve here with a special Nations in Arms video for you today. We are going to be talking about how the game mechanics of Nations in Arms do all come together to create a pretty compelling way to get a mostly historical version of the Napoleonic Wars period. I think in many ways better than other games that I've seen to a degree that I quite like. So this is going to be not quite a gushing video of talking about how great the game is, but to really explain kind of how things come together that are not necessarily explicit in the rule book. Like the rules are there, but only in the application of the rules do these things really actually come together. Something I've really appreciated about the game, and I'm also looking for those things, right? Like how does is this representing this? I'm really trying to look at it, and I'm generally finding it to be pretty sound, pretty helpful in understanding how these things could come together. Now, this is not from any interaction with the game designer, so I could be getting things wrong. It could be that's not what he intended, but maybe that's just what happened, and it's still good for that reason. And it always remains possible that I could still be interpreting something a bit differently than was intended, but that's okay. Overall, I'm pretty stoked for it. Now, first thing right out of the gate, there are many Napoleonic games that will get looked at that are strategic level with a little bit of operational stuff, like many strategic games that many folks will look at and say that's not a historical game. You could point that to Empires in Arms. You could point that to the card-driven game Napoleonic Wars. You could probably say that about War and Peace to a certain degree, depending on what scenario you're playing, maybe in War and Peace. Um, in this game, right, you can make the claim that it's not going to end up being very historical. Um, the reason for that is those almost all of these games can be structured to be multiplayer games where each player at the table, human being, is playing a major power, and they can make the decisions about when to join an alliance, when to break an alliance, when to betray their buddies, when to hold back, and maybe not be super duper helpful to pursue their own diplomatic agenda. All of those games have that. Napoleonic Wars has that, because Prussia could actually choose to join France in that game, and there's often a decent reason to do so in that game. In this game, certainly because each major power has their own victory conditions, and that's something we haven't really talked about in my video series, and I'm probably not going to quite get to it, but each faction has its own victory conditions that could lead it to swapping, swapping sides maybe more than once to achieve the things that they want to achieve. Like Spain would like to control certain parts of Italy. How would Spain do that? It's going to require, um, various events happening just a certain way, and that's going to drive the player behavior. And I think when you look at scenarios like that, you just have to accept it, right? Like there is no way in a game like this that has much more open diplomacy where a player can decide for Austria to sign an alliance with France in 1806 if they really wanted to. Whenever you let a game happen that way, you're inevitably going to have things become more ahistorical. But the game is kind of designed to let that happen. That's kind of the point. Why else sit with five of your friends or four of your friends and play this big diplomatic strategic war game if not to be in control of your power and do the things that you want to do and pursue victory, right? And it is that human intention, either because the player doesn't know the history very well and doesn't want to play to that script, or it might not always be, perfectly the right thing to play historically, and the historical actors didn't necessarily know that. So I think, as a blanket statement for most Napoleonic strategic games, whenever you're playing a multiplayer game or a multiplayer version, you're tending to not get historical results in terms of what factions are aligned with who and who's fighting what and where. I think that should never be considered a slight against games like this. Um, it's kind of an aside and not really part of the rest of this video, but I felt like I needed to get that out early. So whenever you see somebody say that such and such game that's a Napoleonic strategic game is not historical, they're probably talking about the multiplayer scenario, and they're probably right, but it's not a valuable statement to me. That's not, it doesn't really say anything about the game, because the alternative would be to be straitjacketed into a situation, and then maybe you're purely fighting out the operational battle related things. But the whole point of a strategic level is you do more than that. So keep that in mind if you're out there perusing the forums of the wargaming community and you see that kind of commentary. That's just my opinion on it. You know, you have your own, that's okay, but that's my stance, which is why for this video, the rest of it, we're really going to be focused on the two-player version of the game. So when you're playing two-player, certain rules don't apply, certain rules do apply. It's just to handle the game differently because you have to handle the major powers that don't have their own player playing them. And so we're going to talk to that. And technically is under those rules that I played my solitaire game. So, you know, for me, it was just easier to say, you know, player one and player two rather than player five, you know, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, or whatever. And that's what we're going to be looking at. And when I talk about the mechanics in this video, they are going to be wrapped up in the two-player version. You will often hear that yes, most Napoleonic games do play pretty well two-player, and it's because you are reducing the number of you know, brains in the situation, right? It's just two players, and then the game tends to have, you know, rails to keep the historical narrative in there somewhere, even if it's really kind of still very open. So like Napoleonic Wars, you can spend cards and eventually make some diplomatic plays that might be a little bit beyond what you might initially expect. And you know, you know, War and Peace kind of has this really weird funky way that they try to handle things. In here in Nations in Arms, I think that the two-player system, if you're using the Alliance credit system alongside, actually works pretty well. And the reality that I found is that the Alliance credit system should really be called like the Tilsit system. So if there is one refinement to the game, it would probably be that the Alliance credit system really be transformed into something just for Russia. Because in my opinion, it didn't matter enough to make other powers drop from an alliance. Like it just never quite worked out that way. The conditions for um, the conditions for dropping the alliance credit are such that you need major battles or armies being destroyed, and that happens infrequently enough that it is possible that you're probably just going to conquer a country by taking their capital before some of these other things happen. So I think that's okay. But it is very useful for, very specifically for the 1806 time period where France is fighting Prussia and then also Russia, or very likely Russia at that point. Um, and you need some way to get the Treaty of Tilsit where Russia pieces out. And the game mechanics, if you don't use the alliance credit system, you're just not going to get that, right? You're going to be fighting with Russia until the bitter end, or it gets conquered, or something. And if you're not playing with the alliance credit system, that's just the way it's going to be, which is not historical, mind you. If you play with the alliance credit system, you will find, as I did, that that is the way to get the Treaty of Tilsit. That is how Russia will sign a peace deal for some peace clauses and exit the war for a certain amount of time, and to fit the sort of storyboard of the historical narrative in this game, that is what needs to happen. It is conceivable to have other factions and other alliances drop low enough in the alliance credit system to want to peace out, but I think in most other situations, the French player, for instance, is not going to want that to happen because they would like to conquer them. And anyone that's allied to France, you probably don't need to use the alliance credit system because they're likely in a mandatory alliance, which you're going to break via other means that are easier, ideally, or it's Spain and they're going to have a liberation war. So the entire alliance credit system to me is most valuable to make sure that a Treaty of Tilsit situation is possible and can happen. So if you're looking to play the Grand Campaign, I would recommend you play with the alliance credit system. But I think once you've gotten past the first war with Russia, you probably don't need to keep using it, but that's up to you. That's just my recommendation. You could kind of ignore it after you do that, because otherwise, the like it didn't make sense to do the alliance credit system in the second Russian war of my playthrough, because we wanted to conquer Russia for victory conditions. Like it is feasible that you could have gotten an agreeable peace with Russia, and in terms of strategy, you might do that so that you can exit Russia without conquering it. Um, but that's in pursuit of a different victory condition if you do it, and then you don't get the rewards for conquering Russia that come out, like you expanding Poland and getting them some help, or getting indemnities or military aid, or the continental system, or what. Like it's just that the results are not as good if they piece out with a mandatory, or they piece out through the alliance credit system. You'll get something, but not as much as if you had conquered Russia. So there's a little bit of, I guess, still a reason to use the alliance credit system even in 1812, but your mileage may vary. But I think it's important to note that there is still something valuable and good about having the alliance system, period, because again, otherwise you're having to still come up with some bespoke rules for the Treaty of Tilsit. I think War and Peace have some of those, and this game has a way to represent it, and it does largely make sense, even if it is, um, even if it is a little wonky, and I'd prefer some refinement to it. It still works, and so that's important. So um, let me kind of pull us back a little bit. I jumped right into Russia because Russia's fresh off my mind in talking about the alliance credit system and Tilsit. But let me rewind a little bit and talk about just from, if you're starting the game from 1805, how do these things evolve out? I think that is important to follow the structure and the narrative of the history against a campaign game. Okay, so if we follow the historical narrative, we would have, and I'm sorry, you're kind of seeing on map right now the aftermath of my campaign, but at least have something relevant to talk to, and we'll point out certain things on the map along the way here. But at the beginning of the 1805 scenario, realizing that my 1805 campaign attempt ended prematurely with some gross luck for the French, which goes for both campaigns, I guess. Uh, I think the 1805 starts off appropriate, where the Austrian armies are in an okay position, but the game does tell them to play dumb, and try to overextend themselves. I think you could certainly look at the play dumb rules and go, "That's silly. Let's not play with that." But then you wouldn't get the events at Ulm, and you wouldn't get an Austerlitz necessarily. You probably end up with something very different. And maybe that's what you're going for in your campaign, especially, maybe you're playing with a buddy who's already been there, done that, and you guys want to play something different. Maybe you start off 1805 with Austria not having to be shackled to these play dumb rules. And play dumb rules are like, you gotta go for Ulm, you gotta go for Mantua, and you can't stop until you've besieged those places. But first, I think the army here first has to go to Regensburg, and then to Ulm, or something like that. Like, you have to go do these things. You must try, do your best level effort to get into that place and try to take it. Which means that, as the French, you can react to that appropriately. You know where they're going. There is no question, and that gives you a bit of an edge. But that edge does, lend itself to Austria falling, and things are structured such that Russia probably can't get there in time to save Austria, which is historical. So when you look at the 1805 like main campaign seasons, that is going to play pretty historically. France is going to get into Austria very likely, and very likely defeat them, and you can be fairly certain of that. And that feels pretty good. And then in terms of the historical narrative, like, the Austrian player is incentivized at that point to not continue the war, because what the coalition player, I should say, because remembering this is the two-player game. The coalition player probably doesn't want Austria to fight on, because of how punishing a continuation war result would be, especially if Austria is just totally out of it and Russia by itself can't stop Napoleon. If it's looking like Russia is not going to be able to completely defeat France on its own and basically liberate Austria, then you're probably better off just asking for the immediate peace deal so you can come back in with Austria around 1809, or at least that's conceivable. So the victory at Austerlitz, over hereabouts, I think where it would be, and then you take this, you're done, you get out, right? You've knocked Austria down a peg, but the fighting with Russia still continues. From there, historically, is where in 1806 Prussia enters the war, and in this game system, very generally, we should expect to see that Prussia joins Britain. Now, it's conceivable that Prussia, if France tried to leverage its money this way, like maybe you really try hard to convince Prussia to join France. I think that's probably the most ahistorical thing that could happen in any Napoleonic game. Um, I'm certainly not convinced that it's in any way reasonable that Prussia would join France. Like I just don't see that being possible. But what this game does that other games do not, and I appreciate it. This is probably we're going to repeat this throughout this, what will probably be a very long video. There is a key thing here to keep in mind, which is that much of the die rolling in this game operates on a bell curve. It typically uses 2d6. There's a few die rolls in the game that use a single d6. By and large, it uses a 2d6, which gives you a bell curve. If you're designing a game, at the end of the day, everything comes down to percentages, and you can map a static 1d10 or a 1d6 table roughly to the results that you want from a bell curve. You just have to arrange the percentages differently. But all that aside, the bell curve is useful because what it means is you have a normalized set of things that are going to happen a lot. Like we're going to roll 7 a lot, right? If you roll 7 a lot, and that's going to be your common result, the most common result you're going to get from a 2d6 die roll is a 7. And then you base your modifiers tacked onto that, you can pretty reasonably be able to say, just looking, and I'm going to start using some math terms, but you can start looking at like a standard deviation. Get back to uh, you know calculus or algebra or whatever class that they talk about standard deviations in. You can start to map that out, right? Within a couple standard deviations, you will succeed at avoiding combat, intercepting combat, influencing this minor country, influencing this major country, depending on your modifiers. And can you reasonably expect to achieve something with still the possibility that you're going to roll badly and not get it? But you can, if you can get the modifiers up and you roll a 7, which you're very likely to do on 2d6, you have a pretty good idea of knowing if you're going to succeed in that die roll. And in the diplomatic game, that is very important, a huge part of it. And what's important is that this game uses modifiers. So here's Prussia's chit. There is a chart for this in the player charts, but on the back, you can see there are natural modifiers. So Prussia likes Russia okay, Prussia likes Britain okay with a +1, and then doesn't like Austria so much. So what this means is when you're playing as Britain in a 2-player game, you will have a base bonus to influence Prussia on your side. You usually are going to be spending money, which that's a whole part of the eco game, the economic game, to have money to spend for this sort of thing. But Britain's going to have the money to do it, because their force limit on what they can build each spring is low enough that they're going to have excess money to use for these sorts of things. They're going to spend the money to get the extra bonuses. So by and large, Prussia is going to end up having something of a +3 modifier whenever Britain really wants to commit to bringing Prussia in. So they have a pretty reasonable chance of doing it with a +3. They do need to roll a little bit higher than average. They're going to need to roll a 9. So it's not automatic, but you have a pretty reasonable chance of pulling Prussia in. There is a special rule in the game that Prussia can't leave its territory right away, and that is to kind of help reflect the fact that the king of Prussia was uncertain about getting involved, and so like it also keeps the game from getting too imbalanced where, well, by gosh, if Prussia just joined right away, France would be in deep, deep trouble having to fight Prussia, Austria, and Russia all at once, right? So there's a little bit of controlling mechanics there, but it works out okay where you will eventually pull Prussia in, or if you don't, if Britain fails to bring Prussia in, um, that actually works out pretty well for France because France is probably going to want to get into Prussia anyway. So think about that for a second. Like France is probably not going to want to be spending the money to convince Prussia, and Britain's always going to have the advantage due to the die roll modifiers. But if Britain is failing to bring Prussia in and spending the money, that just makes it easy. Like, hey, Britain just spent 12 money, wasted. Let's go ahead and give them Prussia as an ally anyway, but on our terms, and we're going to invade and do what we need to do. So Prussia entering in the 1806 timeframe is certainly feasible from wanting to get them in as Britain. Like they should want to do that so that Russia is not fighting France alone. Um, and ultimately, France probably wants to be able to do it too, because they need to put Prussia into a peace treaty. They do need to do that. There is like many Napoleonic games, a whole thing about managing the diplomatic status of countries, where you need to have a country suppressed, because the longer they're suppressed, the easier it is for you to do what you need to do in the game, and shift your attention so the French armies aren't fighting everywhere at once. So even if Britain's not pulling Prussia in, France probably wants to declare war on Prussia anyway. So and 1806 is a great time to do it. You just finished fighting Austria. You're probably going to want to go to Prussia next. That's an obvious place to go. So I think no matter what, you probably still look at Prussia happening in 1806 with Russia also there. And the historical narrative works out to where the French armies, defeat Prussia. um, they're going to be in a conquer state. Russia is still in country, so there is a reason for the coalition player to say Prussia is going to fight on, hoping that Russia can relieve them. Now, historically, that's ended up not being what happens, but that is sort of the game justification for the game justification for doing a continuation of the war, which is how you get the historical result, which Prussia continued the war. Didn't matter. They get conquered. They get 8 peace clauses. They get an extended peace, mandatory alliance, and all that stuff for Prussia. I think there's a game incentive to end the war early and just take that first peace deal. And the coalition player, I guess, historically made a mistake in game terms of continuing the war, maybe. Um, but it is something to keep in mind because it would allow Prussia to come back in maybe like 1810 to to come back, right? So there's a little bit of a decision point there. Do you think you can do you think you can hold it? Um, and that's just going to be kind of up in the air. Um, but in the process, again, the historical narrative being the Russians are also defeated badly enough that in the alliance credit system, they peace out and you get some peace clauses. So what do you end up around the 1807, 1808 time frame is, Austria is under mandatory peace and is recovering. Prussia does a continuation war with Russia and ends up being defeated anyway and gets some pretty harsh terms issued on it. And Russia signs the Treaty of Tilsit, getting into the continental system and all that good fun stuff. And that kind of takes you up through the early phases of the Grand Campaign. And to me, it feels historical. Things line up pretty well there. Obviously, things could go differently, but it's pretty good. Okay, so while as I just mentioned, the whole historical narrative of getting into Austria, getting into Prussia, and then defeating Russia enough to get the functionally the Treaty of Tilsit. Um, that takes us up to about the 1807 ish, 1808 time frame, and that works pretty well. Again, the diplomacy systems, the alliance credit system in a two-player game maps pretty well to the historical narrative. And yes, you could get some reversals. Maybe Napoleon gets defeated, and you can play that to a reasonable conclusion. But on the odds and with all the modifiers for combat, this, that, and the other, that's going to follow a pretty decent trajectory. Now, for Spain, any good Napoleonic game is going to have, wars for Spain no longer being best friends with France. Maybe best friends is a strong term. Now, the game has a couple ways to handle this. So at the beginning, Spain is allied with France and is in a conflict, potentially here with Portugal and Britain sending aid and an army down there to attack in Spain. Now, for all that Spain is, at the beginning of the game, their forces are okay. Their units don't have a whole lot of advantages, and against the better quality British troops with the modifiers for the British units, you are likely to see Spain not be able to do well on their own. Now, maybe get some wild luck and Spain can hold its own, but it's very likely that they're not going to be able to. There are special rules that France cannot simply send units into their ally to help, like most other powers that would be allied with France if they ever become allied with France. But they've got this like Spanish pride rule is the way to look at it, I guess, where like Spanish will not let their allies into their territory unless certain things are afoot. Um, that is actually in the rule book here. So if the Bayonne Trap card has been played, or they've suffered a major or minor battle defeat, which a minor battle is pretty likely to happen generally, so that's gonna take place, or they lose all their fleets. If that happens, then their ally can come and help, and I think there's certainly an incentive to do so as France if you've got the units, around, and you probably do, to go lend a hand, because if you don't, if Spain is simply remaining allied to Britain, and Britain defeats Spain, let's say they conquer them, right? They take Madrid, they take the relevant places. They have multiple avenues to get there from Gibraltar through Portugal. Maybe they make a landing along the coast. If the coalition defeats Spain, they're going to, but what's probably going to happen is you're going to have some peace clauses. Now, maybe France tells Spain to do a continuation war and they fight it out, which again, I don't know if that's going to be worthwhile to do. But either way, if the coalition gets peace clauses, what they're probably going to end up doing is either taking provinces from Spain, which would support Portugal or at least make it difficult for them to operate, or they're going to do any number of things, right? They're going to ask for money, they're going to ask for this, that, and the other, and then the other thing that's going to occur there is it's going to give the coalition the ability to move through Spain, though they'll need their own supply line. But that's not so bad, because probably what's going to happen is the British can then start moving forces into Saint Sebastian via a naval transport, and then move into France proper. So if Spain just out and out loses to the coalition, and France is not helping them, like chooses not to help them, it does give the coalition a relatively safe path into southern France. Maybe not a huge deal, but it's certainly something nice. And then, of course, all of those trade points remain going to Britain, and the continental system is very far away from ever being achieved. So I think there's an incentive for France to help Spain, certainly. But by having units in Spain, that is what can trigger the liberation war mechanics. So the way that really works, again, is over time, it becomes easier and easier for Britain to diplomatically influence Spain. It's similar to a mandatory alliance thing, but they kind of have their own table of results where, you can get some modifiers, roll that bell curve, but eventually that bell curve is going to get easier and easier to achieve success, where if there are French units in Spain, Spain fights a liberation war and they automatically join the coalition. The Other way that that can happen is also with a card play. So there are multiple avenues to reach this conclusion. So no matter how it happens, the game provides multiple avenues to make it likely to happen. And that's kind of a nice thing. It's not like it's not guaranteed to happen a singular way and you're straitjacketed to it. It's really just multiple ways it could happen. And it just increases the very good likelihood that it will indeed happen. If you don't have any units in there, right? Like let's say Britain decides not to conquer Spain, but to kind of just hold the ground and wait out the Liberation War. They could just do that. They could do well. They could fight Spain. Spain does not have any guerrillas at this point, so that it's just a symmetrical war that Britain would probably be winning. If the Liberation War occurs and there are no French units on the board, then Spain just joins the coalition straight up, and then um, France could defeat Spain by conquering them the standard way. So there's definitely this idea that like, well, if you don't send units down there at all, you don't fight a liberation war as France, but then you're just going to have Spain probably flip on you anyway, and you're going to have to fight potentially in France against Spanish and British forces heading north. So in that from that perspective, like the coalition player probably doesn't totally conquer Spain. They simply fight and wait for their opportunity to convince Spain to switch sides. All that's covered in the same rules section about Spanish instability, but it's, here's your die rolls. Eventually, by 1807, 1808, it starts to become much more likely to occur. And by 1810, you're almost guaranteed to have it happen. Um, there is some minuses to the die roll based on how many steps are there. So if France comes in force, you could basically make it really hard to succeed at this. But I think the British are going to certainly be trying to make it happen. Um, yeah, so you got to watch out for that. So it's likely you could really try to keep it from happening, but I think it'd be very difficult to achieve that. And uh, that Dos de Mayo card is really what's going to flip it no matter what. So if you do it with a diplomacy check, there are some modifiers. France could maybe keep it from happening by having enough units in the country, but the Dos de Mayo card is going to trigger that. And if you have um, if you if you end up having it happen, right, and you have units, then you get the Liberation War mechanics in full. But again, in many ways, I'd say you'd rather be fighting the War of Liberation and all the craziness that occurs there than simply waiting for Spain to flip on you and then you're fighting, over here, right? You'd much rather be fighting way down here than having to defend Toulouse or Bordeaux from coalition forces. So I think, the game incentivizes you to be in there, to be in Spain for all the trouble that it's going to cause. I think you need to try to be in there. Once the Liberation War kicks off, then it's a real question of, how will things pan out from there, where uh, Spain and Portugal will have their guerrilla units, which can set up kind of anywhere as long as it's not adjacent to an enemy controlled fortress or unit, and they can be looking to cut supply line. When you combine that with the increased attrition die roll modifiers in Spain, you truly get a lot of attrition, and it can really bleed off a lot of French forces down here in general. The requirement to take every harbor as a special way to conquer, and that includes Portugal, is rather interesting. It's a very different sort of victory condition because you can't do the normal conquer a major country rules here because basically France had control of Madrid, but Spain fought on. So a little bit of the nuanced rules there to represent Spain's very specific situation does end up coming out to be pretty darn close to how it should be. I think. I mean, I don't know a way to make it any better than it is. I think it's a very good way of portraying that situation by taking all of the ports, including Portugal. What you're basically doing is like you control the capital and you've shut off all other aid to help that rebellion, and then at which case it's over and Spain is conquered. What's interesting about it is it doesn't seem like you can do a continuation war. So, or war continuation, whatever you want to call it. So, if France succeeds in doing that, then you get the four peace clauses, and I covered in a previous video, like what do you interpret that to be, right? It could be by the time you finish it, and there's a bit of an incentive to not finish it fast if you can finish it fast. I think there's a certain like you're not going to close up the War of Liberation too soon. Like it's going to take time. It's going to take time to get all the way down here. It's going to take time all the way to get over here. You technically don't need Gibraltar, but I mean, if you can get it, you should get it. But if you can get all that stuff together, it's going to take you a while. It might take you a couple of years of game time, several seasons of fighting back and forth and trying to achieve victory if you ever do. So by the time it comes in, it kicks in, whatever peace deal you get with Spain will probably take you through the end of the game like it did in my campaign. Um, so there's definitely an incentive to try to win that war of liberation as France. You can interpret that as maybe Bonaparte getting to keep his brother on the throne of Spain with some treaties to like not involve them in the broader wars of Europe, except for some minor military aid, which is how we handled it in my game. And that feels okay. Like I'm willing to accept that as like, yeah, what would have happened if France somehow put down the rebellion? We don't know what that looks like. Could they have ever put down the rebellion? But for game purposes, you have to come up with a scenario that does that. I think this is a pretty good one. So overall, I'm pretty happy with that. I do think the like we ended the war by I think it was like 1810 or whatever because France put all their effort into Spain, and that put them at risk in Eastern Europe. But that was enough to do it. But even then, it was very hard. It was very hard from the attrition. It was very hard dealing with guerrillas. We got fortunate in some die rolls catching Wellington, where he was going to avoid combat, but he rolled snake eyes and got caught up. If he hadn't had that, maybe things would be different. So I do see this as the Spanish ulcers there. I think I could have played better as the coalition in my game, where the guerrillas, I think I just didn't use them as good as I could have. I was using them as kind of like near supply cutting when I could have stayed back here and cut the whole supply line. But that could have been mitigated by France sending a couple of corps over here to just push those guerrillas out of the way. So there's definitely a cat and mouse game there that I think if I had practiced by playing the Spanish ulcer scenario before the Grand Campaign, I could have gotten much better and really figured out all the right ways to use the guerrillas the best way. Put them in the mountains and then have them leave and jump behind somebody. If I had done more of that, I could see Spain triumphing in the War of Liberation. And my game just didn't work that way. But again, if I had more practice and if you're going to play this with your friends and you want to get really good and you know you're going to control Spain, maybe play that Spanish ulcer scenario and get good at how to cut off those supply lines, how to really hurt the French. I think with some practice, it would be very devastating for the French player. In this one, I think my lack of experience leveraging the guerrillas contributed to France being able to win, but by no means is that that was really not guaranteed, and it really should have probably gone the other way if I was just playing a bit more competently. So with some practice, I definitely see the Spanish ulcer being a thing here. I think the way the game handles it does it pretty well. The key thing being, if you win the War of Liberation, and I think the War of Liberation is almost guaranteed to happen at some point, barring a couple of exceptions, where you've got to either go super hard into Spain or not. Um, you're almost going to have to fight it. It's going to happen, and if you put enough force in there to do it, there are a number of great rewards for doing it. The continental system, a front you don't have to fight on anymore. It's all a bunch of good stuff. So I think the game handles it really well. Where the French player has to be invested in Spain to some degree. They have to decide, are they going to go lightly on it, and there's pros and cons to that? Are they going to go heavy on it, and there's pros and cons to that? Because I mean, at some point, you're almost going to have to perpetually occupy Spain at that point, due to the way the Spanish instability rules work, where you can keep the modifiers down so that they can't succeed in the die roll, but you got to have so many units in here occupying Spain that like those are fewer units you have to fight Russia with. So there's a balancing act there that I really like. You have to make a strategic decision. I think that's very strong in the game design. Whether or not that's the intention, I don't know, but that is how it works in practice. That decision, deploy a ton of units here, and now they're here forever. They've got to occupy Spain, and if you ever pull too many away, then the liberation war goes on. You send too few, and they revolt anyway, and now you're fighting a liberation war but nearer to Spain. So it's like there's no perfect answer. You just have to pick what you think is going to make sense. How you want to achieve victory is France, and I think that works really, really well. So that kind of takes us on that really covers the whole Spanish front for the way the game works. I think it does pretty well. So let's steer our attention back towards Central and Eastern Europe for the rest of, I guess, 1809 and beyond. All right, so as we continue to look at the narrative, maybe before we talk strictly about Germany and the rest of Eastern Europe, maybe talking very briefly about Italy. Obviously, early on, France is going to probably push the Austrians out of northern Italy and form the Kingdom of Italy. The Kingdom of Italy is a handy ally with enough forces to help take Naples, and you definitely want that for the continental system. So, like most other Napoleonic strategic level games, fighting in Italy and then down to Naples does happen. It's not a super primary theater. The number of forces there is usually not very big, but it is interesting, trying to get into the papacy, conquering Rome, moving down to Naples. That's an element of stuff that is something you don't want to ignore, and that feels appropriate. Like you've got to siphon off a couple of core down there. Depending on how things go, Britain may really commit hard to southern Italy, and we saw some of that occur in my game, and that feels about right. With things from Eastern Europe, when we talk about like 1809 time frame in a grand campaign, that should be about the time if Austria took a non-continuation war. It's likely around this time frame that mandatory peace is going to be ending, and Austria will have been trying to build up forces. Now, this is where I kind of have to be very clear um, to talk about the way that production works and who controls what. So in the two-player game rules, if a power is unplayed, meaning it's neutral, then France will control Spain when neutral and will control the Ottomans when neutral for movement and production. Movement tends not to be very exciting because you don't get to move a whole lot of stuff, but production does matter, and in fact, it's going to matter for a lot of the rest of this discussion here. So very generally, right, when you're using Spain at the beginning of the game, France is going to control their production. They could. I didn't do this because I didn't realize that I could have done it this way. You could certainly try to sandbag things, and when I say sandbag, what I mean is like waste production. So a power gets a certain amount of production based on a number of factors, but it doesn't require you to spend them. You just choose to spend them, and you could save the money. You could quote unquote choose to save the money for diplomacy or any number of things. But in a two-player game, it's only Britain and France that really use money for diplomacy. So that money could simply be saved, and then you lose it at the end of the year. So sandbagging in this context means that the major power in control of the unplayed major, or the player in charge of the unplayed major when they're neutral, or even when they're allied for that matter, can choose to not build anything, just to not to build anything. And so there are certainly some cases maybe in Spain where the French player may decide to simply not rebuild any units. That kind of that gets back into the Spanish conversation, which I just wrapped up. But that's a factor that you might decide. I think in my game I just built what I could of Spain because I wanted to keep Britain from getting too much power on the board and be in too good of a position. As we start looking to the east, that decision making matters a lot. So while Austria is neutral, and while Prussia is neutral, and while Russia is neutral, those three powers, the big three on the continent that France has to watch out for, they are all controlled by the British player when unplayed, when neutral especially. So that means that when they're not at war with France, they're going to be spending all of their money each spring turn building up their armies and preparing to fight the French. That includes Austria. So while Austria is neutral after being defeated in 1805, 1806 timeframe, they're going to be building up their forces, and they're going to be building up at the direction of the British player, which is going to make them as strong as possible. And again, when we look at the diplomatic modifiers, France has a -1, Britain has a +2. So when you look at the bell curve again, while maybe France could try to spend some money bringing Austria into their side, and it's conceivable they could try to do that, it's less likely, right? It doesn't, and I think that's the right balance in a game like this. You don't want to make it impossible. You could say that it's unlikely, but how do you account for other types of deals? Maybe Napoleon agrees to marry the Austrian emperor's daughter. I think it was his daughter. Earlier than they did historically. How do you represent that? Is that what that represents? You need some wiggle room there, but the bell curve allows us to say that that's less likely. They have a -1 modifier due to the natural dislike of Austria for France, and it's more likely that Britain will succeed. And the way that the diplomacy order goes, France goes first, Britain goes next. So if France succeeds, Britain has a pretty good opportunity to pull that power back to neutrality before the end of the diplomacy phase. So at worst, France might get to cost the British player money by pulling Austria over, and then Britain just pulls it back out, and then the next turn, so on and so forth. But it's more likely that Britain, with its modifiers, will eventually get to influence Austria first. The threshold for diplomatic success is a 12. So it's not just like a 9 or a 10 or something. Like 10 is usually what it is for avoiding combat and interception. But on this bell curve, you actually need a 12. So if you don't have modifiers, and you don't have good modifiers, it's a very small chance that you'll actually succeed unless you're rolling boxcars. So boxcars being 2 6s. So Britain's going to succeed at influencing Austria, and right around that 1809, maybe 1810, depending on how the peace die rolls went, you're going to have Austria rejoin the coalition with a rebuilt and strengthened army. And during that time period, it is likely that Prussia, if they went to a continuation war, is still under a peace treaty, maybe going to end up in a mandatory alliance at some point. For France, um, or if the case is that Prussia maybe didn't do a continuation war, it might not be too long before they're out as well, which is going to require France to defeat Austria and maybe have to fight Prussia all over again. So there's some element there that really depends on, did Prussia continue on or not. The historical narrative is that they did, but anyway, the key point is there will be another fight against Austria. This is that, where you get Wagram historically, where Austria just gets beat down again. And I do think that's going to be reasonably possible of what's going to happen. Again, it's going to depend on how many French forces are in Spain, but you're going to need some strength to fight a very rebuilt and strong Austria. So you'll hit that phase of the game, and again, I think you could see an upset. You could see Austria maybe win, maybe a situation where the Spanish ulcer is going really bad for France, and Austria is capitalizing on that. And that's what's keeping the game exciting, is that it's not simply, okay, now France is going to continue to knock everybody down, even if that's what happened in my game. There's still a potential there that that's the year of decision. 1809 could be a reversal, and the coalition could be making inroads against France along the way. The challenge then is a race on diplomacy, because maybe Prussia's going to leave neutrality and go to a mandatory alliance, and this is where again that control comes in. So from the time period that Prussia is defeated, Prussia is neutral. If they're going to be in a mandatory alliance, right, then they're going to join France eventually. And what the British player is probably going to do, as the controller of a neutral Prussia, is not build anything at all during 1808 or 9 or whatever, until the mandatory alliance kicks in. Britain's not going to build anything, so Prussia will not be a very useful ally until the mandatory alliance kicks in, and then a spring phase comes. So the timing of when the peace treaties come into play actually matters a lot. You want to be in control of that power during spring so you can decide to build their forces or not, and that's actually a huge factor in the game. So if it's, hey, they don't become a mandatory ally until summer, I can basically assume they're not going to be of any help that year because during the preceding spring, the turn prior, Britain still controls Prussia's production. They're going to say we're not building shit, and and France can't count on them until the next year, in which case, then they're going to build them up. I'm going to pause there for a second because we're going to get even more into the details of this. But when you're counting that out, right? Again, when Austria gets defeated, Wagram or otherwise, they will be neutral, and Britain's going to do the same thing. During peace, Austria's not going to build anything if we know there's going to be a mandatory alliance. If for some reason the mandatory alliance is not asked for or doesn't happen, that means that that power will be neutral. It's not going to go to France's side right away. Britain's probably advantaged to convince them to join the coalition again. So Britain probably would build them back up. Maybe not to the fullest extent, because there is a risk that maybe France tries to diplomatically influence them. Though I think France is going to be busy spending its money elsewhere and just doesn't have the free money to spend like Britain might. Um, that's a factor, but that's the important thing. So France really wants there to be a mandatory alliance, which comes in either because of a continuation war, or it's the second time that power's been conquered. So for Prussia, historically they continued. Austria gets the mandatory alliance because they were conquered twice, from the 1809 campaign being the second time. So ideally, France gets in a position where both Prussia and Austria have been defeated such that they get put into mandatory alliances, which is historically what happened, or that's how we would interpret that. Somewhere along the way, France probably also liberates Poland and gets the Duchy of Warsaw going. What's important to know is that if they do that, there's pros and cons. The pro is they have a minor country ally that is going to be, ride or die for France in the middle of Eastern Europe and serves as a supply source for them functionally. Um, so that's very important. But by doing that, you are committing a certain posture against Russia because so long as the Duchy of Warsaw exists, there's a +1 basically to the British player to convince Russia to join. And that's the real danger is, does Russia join the war against France early because you've created the Duchy of Warsaw? And we understand that really Russia was not in, didn't really necessarily do anything until 1812 anyway. I know we make a big deal about Napoleon invading Russia. There is a whole thing where they, basically they were issuing an ultimatum to Napoleon anyway that if he didn't leave Prussia, they were going to come to blows. So, I mean, we make a big thing of, Napoleon invading Russia, but war was going to break out anyway. So just the nature of Poland existing means it's a ticking time bomb for Russia. Russia will eventually join Britain. Russia's chit, when we look on the back of that sucker, sure enough, not liking France, but liking Britain quite a bit. So on that bell curve, it's only a matter of time. And it's it's a reasonable expectation that if Britain spends the money, Russia will join the coalition once the peace treaty that would be signed from the Treaty of Tilsit, whenever that was, expires. And depending on, again, what the peace die roll was, the timing of that may be variable, and you're going to need to really pay attention to that. I do recommend writing little notes and putting them nearby so you know when these things are going to occur, because as the French player, again, I'm going to draw a comparison to WIF. You need to know your timing. Like if you're Germany in World in Flames, you need to know your timing of when you're invading what and where and how fast. You kind of got to do something here too, but your timers on these peace deals. When does a front open up? Are you ready to move to that other front? Have you defeated the other power? So all of this becomes this ticking time bomb, but having Warsaw as a supply source is certainly a big help. And if if you're going to go for the victory condition that includes conquering Russia, you're going to need this anyway. So you go for it. Now I want to return to the production thing because I think that's really important, and it's probably one of the most. It's really the reason for this video, period. But I want to make sure I talk to it clearly here in this video. So this whole thing that I was talking about of having the point of this video is it was the eureka moment of realizing as Britain to sandbag with the Prussian production, right? And when again, to reiterate, sandbagging, being able to produce, being in control of the neutral power that is going to produce units, and then choosing to waste their money. Now, it seemed like, if I look at the rules, since gifting is not a part of production, it's not like Prussia could give all their money to Britain. That was my rules interpreted. They can't just give it away, but they can waste it. They can hold on to all of their production, not use it to build units, and then they lose all their money at the end of the turn because only Britain can save money from turn to turn. So, and that's a particular rule. So Prussia, it was that eureka moment where I'm going, well, Prussia's just going to join France, so what am I even building? Should I build anything at all? Well, maybe I don't build anything if I can help it. The one special case is I did use this public card, Landwehr. It says they receive 3 additional infantry steps, and that sounds mandatory. It's not may, it's they just receive them. So these had to be built in my rules. How I interpret this is, even if Austria and Prussia were controlled by Britain and Britain wanted to sandbag and not spend their production, they still get 3 free steps no matter what, if this card has been played. So with that in mind, right, you're basically at best maybe having a few detachments built. Maybe there were a few corps left over from a time that a force surrendered, or units that were still on the board for that power when they went to peace with France. But besides those units, Britain, if controlling a neutral Prussia and Austria, wouldn't build any new units. That was the eureka moment, right? Like, just don't build it. Screw France over. Why not do that? And the first thought might be, hey, that seems kind of gamey, right? That doesn't feel good. That seems unfair to some degree. You might even look at it and say maybe it's not sportsmanlike or something. Like, that's not, that seems foul. But the rules are there, right? It says, hey, if you're in control of that neutral, as an unplayed major, and it's neutral, you control their production, and so you choose to do with that what you will. Once that neutral power goes to a mandatory alliance, then France controls their production, and you can imagine that France will build up the Prussian army and the Austrian army. If you didn't do that, think about this for a second. If Britain went ahead and just built out Prussia's force pool, when Prussia joins the mandatory alliance with France, the Britons just handed to the French player a sizable army that's been built up that could be used to invade Russia. Now, you might think, well, yeah, some Prussians and Austrians joined France in their invasion of Russia. So what's the deal? Well, the reality is, if you go look at, you look at how many went, I think the numbers are like a force of 25,000 Prussians went in, and then a force of like 30,000 Austrians went into Russia, which is, in game terms, I think only maybe a handful of corps, maybe not even that. I'd have to look at the numbers again, but it's not a huge number. And in fact, if I try to look it up right now, yeah, each step is 8,000 infantry. So a corps that is a full strength 2-step corps is already 16,000. So you're only talking about a couple of corps each went into Russia with France. France had a bunch of their own units, some minor countries, some of the German states, and then Prussia effectively giving a few corps, Austria a few corps. Now, again, if we look at like where do those corps come from, it's very likely or entirely possible that they were either leftovers, in game terms, leftover counters that were in these countries when they surrendered and were conquered by France, or maybe have been built up, or maybe are products of the Landwehr card. I kind of got away with using the Landwehr points to build detachments, which are still useful in some capacity, but you're going to end up with a pretty small force, even when Prussia and Austria join the mandatory alliance. They're not going to have much in the way of a big army, which is appropriate, right? So with that, if you sandbag, and the British player should, the armies of Prussia and Austria that go into Russia aren't going to be very big. They're also the only armies on the map, because as the French player, you're not going to keep a bigger Prussian army like back here. No, you're going to want to send them up. And it's this whole thing about the mandatory alliance system that intrigues me so much. The mandatory alliance system is structured such that it represents the fact that neither Prussia or Austria really liked being in an alliance with France. Like they kind of had to, but they didn't like it. It was not their ideal situation. And so this design by effect stuff starts to kick in where by the nature of not wanting to give the French a big mallet, the British constrain the production of Prussia and Austria, which you could interpret it as being Prussia and Austria being kind of lackadaisical about supporting Napoleon, right? And then even after they join the mandatory alliance, so France does control the Prussian Austrian production. A French player would make a mistake by building up both of those powers to their full extent. So even after they've joined a mandatory alliance, and even you get a spring turn where France can build anything that they want, there's going to be a certain finesse to what the French player has Prussia and Austria build. And that means that they're not going to build them out super strong. They may build a lot of detachments or things that will have limited utility. But the reason why they do that, why the French player would do that or should do that, right? Don't make the mistake of building them up too much. Because while a bigger Prussian and Austrian armies can help fight Russia, and that's certainly the point of what forces are allocated, you don't want them too strong. You probably want to wield the Prussian and Austrian armies to take the most damage fighting the Russians if you can help it, so that the French aren't denuded. But you know this because even I think to some degree, probably Napoleon was aware, and the French player should be aware that those mandatory alliances are going to end at some point. Like he's going to be betrayed, right? Napoleon's going to get betrayed. You, the French player, will be betrayed by Prussia and Austria, and so it doesn't help you to have a very strong ally that is reluctantly your ally. You want to have enough of a strength in that ally to fight with you, but not enough to hurt you too badly when they inevitably break ranks with you. And that's the key element here. The mandatory alliance function where the coalition player can eventually diplomatically flip the powers. That mechanic represents the flipping of both Prussia in the spring of 1813 and then Austria in the summer of 1813, flipping back to the coalition, getting the War of the Sixth Coalition. That is how it happens. Is this mandatory alliance breaking? And that involves Britain spending money for the modifiers plus some additional modifiers as diplomatic actions against France, not the power themselves. So those +2 or +1 bonuses don't apply for this. It is purely money spent and then an additional modifier if France suffered a major defeat in the previous turn. So imagine, France having a rough time against Russia or some other force somewhere, maybe in Spain, for instance. It's a major defeat, which, one fault in this game system is it feels like sometimes it's hard to get a major battle, period. You fight a lot of minor battles, but that aside, that provides a +1. And then for the length of the mandatory alliance, for every full year that mandatory alliance has been in effect, you get another +1. So if you figure maybe if you're in a mandatory alliance with Prussia or Austria at some point in 1810 or 1811 or whatever, by 1813 or 1814, the diral modifiers to that check from just that alone could be 1 to 2 to 3. You add in the 2 for the money, and you have a damn good chance of flipping those guys. And it's inevitable. It will happen eventually. And the French player has to keep that in mind. And that means that they may be, like I did, using French resources to sit on top of Prussia, and that represents the occupation of Prussia. And maybe, you can kind of tie that to the ultimatum issued by Russia that like, hey, stop occupying Prussia, get out of Prussia. Well, yeah, you're busy sitting on top of it because you don't want Prussia to flip on you. And even if Prussia does flip on you, you want to be in good shape to basically stop them from being able to operate. And so that ends up being a really, really important thing to watch out for here. So Prussia and Austria will probably
probably, there's a chance they won't, but it's, over time it gets more likely that they'll flip. So you don't want them super strong and you want to use them very carefully. And that adds this level of tension in the 1812, 1813 time frame of the Grand Campaign that does make for some interesting choices, right? How are you structuring your supply lines? Who's capturing which fortress and where? That could end up being a pretty big deal. Now, historically, what we would think probably happens here is the armies are out in towards Moscow. The crazy attrition that comes in with probably the scorched earth card, winter attrition, the movement attrition, it starts to bleed away all of these forces, and eventually, yeah, Prussia flips on France after France just runs out of gas and is potentially having trouble keeping their supply lines open to Poland. And now, Prussia, having broken the alliance, gets a full production turn in a spring, um, or something, right? Like at some point here, Britain is in control of Prussian production. Now, Prussia will build up its forces as much as possible and begin to fight the French. And if they're fighting in Russia, that's real bad news for France. If they're fighting anywhere else, then it gets interesting. And I think in those cases, both Prussia and Austria lock themselves into a continuation war if they're going to be conquered, because between Russian reinforcements, British, whatever else, a Prussian force that can now trace supply, and the French can't, can now start walloping them to start to have that historical fighting through Germany on the way back to France. And from there on out, right, you do have the Prussia, Russia, Austria trifecta, building units, sending units into Germany, fighting the French, the British doing what they can, all the while possibly still fighting in Spain going on. And you eventually reach the conclusion of the War of the Six Coalition, and all the game mechanics there, whether you might have thought them as gamey or not, actually all link together pretty well to give the historical narrative. Within, there's flexibility there for things to be different, but it does generally follow, the mechanics come together to follow that narrative pretty consistently. And it surprised me that it worked that way. Like I was just like, wow, okay, that actually makes some sense. I'm only going into Russia with maybe a little over 30,000 Prussians, which is not that different from history. And maybe I'm going into Russia with a bigger sized Austrian army, but not by that much. And, will that help me out? And I was truly surprised at those eureka moments, because it's not clear in the rule book. Again, it does not tell you to do this. It's not part of the strategy notes anywhere that I could see. But if you're paying attention and you know your Napoleonic history, these things start to come together. And man, it just came together really well. At least in my campaign, even if it was kind of an overwhelming French victory, despite the good luck of the French, I could see a more balanced, end result coming out that sticks much closer to history. If I had played the Russians better, we could have seen the French in much worse shape. And on the same token, I would probably, as the coalition, avoid fighting the Prussians and keep the Prussians alive as much as possible, so that the Prussians could then and the Austrians could be used against the French when the time came. So there's this whole element of, you're not just fighting the enemy units on the board, you're thinking about the position of these other powers and how they're going to relate to each other when the tide turns. And you know the tide eventually will. You don't know exactly when it will, but you know that it will, eventually, with those modifiers, and you have to try to account for it. And that drives so much of the decision making in the game. And I think, just as I'm gushing about this, I think that's one of these things, understanding that the rules are a little undercooked in some places and whatever flaws may be with the game, it's these interlocking bits of the system and the carrots and sticks that drive the player behavior that I really appreciate. You're in a good historical uh, workflow, so to speak, but there is some room for wiggle, and you can still have some triumphant victories, and it feels pretty true to the overarching strategic story of the Napoleonic Wars across those coalition wars, 3 through 6. So let's see what else to say. While I'm here, I guess I should talk about the northern stuff a little bit. When I say northern, I mean North Sea region, Britain, Sweden. Um, the fact that Swedish Pomerania right here is one, owned by Sweden, and two, needed for the continental system provides a nice incentive for France to fight Sweden at some point, whether it's because they've allied with Britain or something, or there is an incentive for France to try to woo Sweden over. Bernadotte might be a unfriendly guy for that, but depends on how you want to look at it. Um, so that's nice. It is good. It provides that reason. The continental system, victory requirement is structured such that for France, like they need to have defeated Russia to some degree, get the continental system in a place. They need to have done something with Sweden one way or another. They must do that. They have to control Denmark. They have to control the Low Countries and the Hansa. They have to control the ports of Spain and Portugal and Italy. They can thankfully ignore Sardinia and Sicily as islands, and technically, and I guess so for Denmark, I should say it's actually the Hansa. They don't need Denmark at all. Um, so my bad on that. But basically, the requirements on the continental system are specific enough to say you do need to have done. There are certain game actions that are required to get there. You need to deal with Sweden. You need to have control of the main parts of the continent. You have to control Portugal, Spain to some degree, or be allied. You also need to go into Naples, control Italy, and you got to have Trieste. And that likely means will have fought Austria at some point or gotten control of that province. And what's nice about that is that there are clear, like, yes, you're going to go do these things. They are kind of historical. There was fighting in these places. So even if you wanted to try to avoid it, you're still going to get steered in that direction. You still got to pay attention. You've got to commit some forces there. But there are still going to be places that are kind of out of reach, but you're not required to go for them. So like you're not going to waste French effort going to Sardinia, and you don't care. At most, you deprive or not. I'm sorry, not Sardinia, Sicily, um, and Malta. Like you're not going to spend a bunch of French manpower trying to take Palermo or the island of Malta. At best you're gonna ping Britain for two trade production points, which yeah, knocking them down is not a bad idea, but it's just way too much effort that you're not going to be able to manage effectively. But the game doesn't expect you to. It doesn't expect you to at all. So that's good. You also don't need to worry too much about the Ottoman Empire, which is a whole other thing. We haven't talked a lot about in the last many videos. The Ottomans are there. Certainly, they're on the map. They can be influenced. There are other games that include the Ottomans in some shape or form, and they're certainly here, and they are considered a major power. Um, they could be influenced, but the what's interesting is the modifiers for, and I say Ottomans, it's called Turkey in the game, but the modifiers are almost none. You don't get a whole lot of. Uh, you got to really invest into the Ottomans, and the Ottomans aren't particularly strong either, to be honest. And they have a lot of land and territory um, to deal with if you had to go deal with it. And the net effect of all these things together is it's probably more pain than it's worth, which is probably accurate, right? Like in the history, like the Ottomans were involved in some fighting with Russia, which is represented by the foreign war card Third Rome, which did come out in our game and serves as a way to draw off Russian Russian stuff. The foreign war cards all kind of do that and provide the mechanism for these other conflicts to take place. But that card, specifically stipulates that they're not at war on the map, and it puts some restrictions on things. So the Ottomans can get involved in stuff, but generally they're not going to, and there's not that much incentive to do it. Like maybe I think the French would like the Ottomans to help fight Austria and maybe Russia, but France probably isn't going to have the money to worry about it, and it's really hard to actually make the Ottoman contribution uh, very meaningful because they're not particularly strong. They have a limited force pool, and they just don't have the resources to make grand campaigns. So unless you're really doing something weird, unless you want to divert a lot of resources into doing it just to do it, you're probably not going to see the Ottomans get involved in a grand campaign. It's low likelihood, and that's to the history. So I think that works well. Like it's not arbitrary. It's not saying you're not allowed to engage with them. You can. It's just costly and maybe doesn't give you as much benefit unless you're going for a gambit. And even then, there's specific instability rules that kicks them back to neutral. So they're represented. They're represented in a way that can provide some interaction, but it's about the right level without being super ahistorical, which sometimes the Napoleonic Wars can be the CDG game because you're just paying card points to influence minors. Here, it's probability based, it's investiture based, and it aligns to history. For Britain, that does mean that they're typically going to get some trade points from the Ottomans. So, actually, steering this back to Britain, which is where I wanted to start this segment, um, they're always going to get some trade. So, even with the continental system in place, they're going to lose a bunch of trade. France is going to get a bunch of money if the continental system is complete. I wish the rules were a little clearer on referring to it as like complete instead of established, because I think that's the key difference in the way you would explain it to somebody. But they're always going to get some trade, and that's going to supplement a pretty decent, just I think it's like 48 production for Britain, period. So Britain's always going to have some money, but it can't build a lot of units. So it has to use that money in other ways, whether that's giving money to other powers to prop them up or to do diplomacy to get a new set of forces into play. And there's definitely a lot of thinking based around that. And combating Britain is difficult because they can deploy their forces in all sorts of places. The key thing here is they do have the Boulogne Dover crossing as a straits, which means that you can come over here, you can try to operate and make something happen, so long as you control the channel. And that's really the big thing. Like it is conceivable to try to make some landings over here, but you're going to have a hard time um, making headway in Britain doing that, just because you're likely going to lose your supply line. So like you're not going to come into here, take Hull, and then try to get down to London. You probably just don't have the time for that. Your best bet is trying to make a crossing at Dover and getting into London. And the whole time, the British fleet is going to try to knock you back out of the channel and cut your supply line and eliminate your army, which is what happened to the French in 1813 for me. It is a worthwhile thing to be looking at, of how do you push back on Britain as France? Well, I think you have, unless you're really lucky, which did happen, you got to fight the fight as France and take over the countries and get that continental system money to build a fleet that can actually contest Britain. And once you're pushing back on Britain, where they're using their excess money trying to rebuild their fleet or building a home defense army, you've now removed the possibility that they're using that money to influence nations. And so that the whole diplomacy sub game does actually attach itself to the military game in the systems. They're pretty well integrated to where you push on one thing and then the bottom falls out of the other, so to speak. If Britain can't afford to influence Austria or can't afford to influence Prussia because you're too busy beating them up, that means that maybe Prussia and Austria acknowledge that France is kind of the superpower right now and they need to bide their time, so you get a little bit of a reprieve, not worrying as much about having them flip on you. So all this stuff, I'm going to wrap this video up here in just a minute, but the point of this video was to talk through all of this, because across like the 12 video, across all the videos that I've done for the Grand Campaign, this stuff isn't readily visible along the way, or you'd have to watch a lot of the videos to see all of these elements. And only now that I'm kind of wrapping up a campaign can I look back and say, oh wow, look at how all this stuff fits together. Obviously, you could have a butterfly effect where if something goes really sideways due to luck, you're not going to see everything play out to history. That's going to happen, right? In any board game. But in particular, I can see now why this game's designed the way that it is, the way the mechanics work the way that they do, because they all interlock together to provide a pretty great way to experience the Napoleonic Wars period, where, at least as a two-player game, again, with the multiplayer is a whole different thing. In a two-player game, you're going to get a very enriched game that has a lot of the considerations. You're going to be thinking about the same kinds of things that I think you should be at this level of a game. And I'm just walking away from it feeling really good. Now, this isn't a review, but this is, appreciating the design elements that are here. And I wanted to talk specifically to this in its own video so that nobody has to watch, 18 hours of other stuff, me fumbling through the game to get this explanation, to appreciate what this game can show and how it works together. So anyway, I hope this was a fun distraction for you guys. I hope you appreciate the video and that it was entertaining to some degree, and this gives you better insight into Nations in Arms in the way the mechanics work. More videos are to come. We will do an 1812 scenario. I may do an 1813 scenario, and we still have the Waterloo sort of the 100 days campaign that I am interested in seeing be played out. So stay tuned for that, guys. And until that next video, please take care, keep gaming, have a great day.